Good afternoon. Thank you for joining in person and also online in this event to launch the publication International Export Regulations and Controls, Navigating the Global Framework Beyond WTO Rules. My name is Roy Santana. I work for the Market Access Division of the WTO, and I'm going to be your moderator this afternoon. As you are aware, the main theme of this year's public forum is It's Time for Action. And I believe that this is by far the session that packs the most action of all the sessions we're going to have this week. In fact, I would argue that it has all the elements for a blockbuster movie. We will be talking about wildlife poachers, drug traffickers, products that can kill or seriously harm people, and the threat of dangerous chemical weapons. Exactly what you need to keep awake after 130 other sessions in the public forum. Now, on a more serious note, this session is relevant to the theme of the public forum because we will be discussing international agreements that exist outside of the WTO framework that have actually coordinated at the global level actions and solutions for problems that have been challenging to the international community. Indeed, one of the common threats of this week's public forum has been that many of the challenges facing us today don't know any border. They are global problems that cannot be solved individually by any country by itself, or even by a very few countries acting together. Some of these problems, if you need to tackle them, international cooperation is not a nice-to-have element. In fact, is a necessity. A second aspect that underpins the publication is the crucial role that trade and trade rules play in addressing these global challenges. In some cases, the international community has come together to ban trade in certain products because they were considered to be dangerous or damaging to society. In other cases, the international community is aware that trade in certain products is required, but trade in these products also comes attached with high risk for society. If I can give you one example, you have chemical products. Imagine that you need to produce medicines, which in the wrong hands can actually pose serious risks for the environment, the health of the people, or could even be used to produce explosives or weapons. If you're fans of the TV series, which is called Breaking Bad, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of these products are referred to as dual-use goods or technology because they could also have a military use, in addition to the civil one. In these cases, the international community has found ways to manage those risks through different mechanisms in order to allow trade to take place, while at the same time minimize the same risk. To do this, it is necessary to control the entire supply chain from the beginning all the way to the end. That means from the producer all the way to the consumer of the good, which is often located in a different country. In other words, you need to control not only the imports, but you also need to be able to control the export and transit of those products to make sure that you have a secure supply chain. So secure supply chain, safe trade, these are terms that you hear very frequently in respect of many of the agreements that we're going to be discussing. And the only way in which these sensitive or dangerous products can remain safe is by ensuring that the exporting country also puts in place some form of enforcement or mechanisms before they are shipped into the importing country. Again, international cooperation through trade rules, and in particular, some form of export regulation or control can be part of the solution to tackling some of these global challenges that we face. A third aspect addressed in the publication is how these international agreements interact with each other, and in particular with the WTO framework. This being a WTO publication, we of course address issues like what are the WTO rules, what is the type of information that members have notified to the different bodies, and in particular, we're going to see the Committee on Market Access. Since the WTO deals with trade, but we are of course not experts on all these other issues that are outside of the WTO framework, we decided to put international cooperation in action and actually reach out to a large number of other organizations to collaborate with us in this project. Fortunately, a large majority of them were very enthusiastic. In fact, I would say sometimes even more enthusiastic than we were to collaborate in this type of project and agreed to work with us. On behalf of the WTO Secretariat, I would really like to extend our most sincere thanks for all the contributions that you did with respect to this publication. And without you, literally, it would have not been possible. Today, we would have liked to have the almost 20 contributors in this panel, but we couldn't find a big enough podium. And then in addition, there is a rule in the public forum where we could only have 5 people in the podium. So we're already kind of pushing the limits on that. We have 7. And then some of the other contributing organizations are also in the room. They are sitting here with us in the front. So we also thank you very much for joining us and coming to the launch of this publication today. Now, without any further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panel of experts who are going to be discussing some of these issues with us today. First of all, we have Miss Evita Ricafort, who is a legal technical officer with the Secretariat of the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. She assists countries with implementation of the convention, as well as the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products. So thank you, Evita, for being with us today. Also, we have Mr. Pavel Pachta. He's a member of the International Narcotics Control Board since 2022. And for those of you who are not aware of this is actually an elected position by the UN Economic and Social Council. He was also part of the Standing Committee on Estimates since 2023. And before this, he served as the Director for International Regulatory Affairs of the International Cannabis and Cannabinoids Institute from 2018 to 2021. So thank you very much for being with us today. Ms. Sophie Fransborg, Chief of the Governing Body Unit at the Secretariat of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. If you're sure you have heard about CITES, so Sophie is our expert from the CITES Secretariat, which is hosted by the United Nations. Throughout her career, Sophie has focused on aspects related to environmental policy, trade, and sustainable development in different organizations. This is very important, both at the national and also at the international level. So she has experience on both sides of the coin. So thank you very much, Sophie, for being with us today. Then finally, we have Vanya. Vanya Kumar is a legal officer in the Office of the Legal Advisor of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. In this capacity, she is engaged in the interpretation and implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and multi-state negotiations within the OPCW policymaking organs, inter alia, on matters concerning international disarmament and arms control. So you can see we have one of the most diverse panels we have had in this public forum. Now, in addition to these 4 distinguished experts in their respective fields, we also are accompanied today by 2 colleagues from the Market Access Division. One of them on my right is Ms. Roberta Lascari, who is the Secretary of the Committee on Market Access of the WTO. And then on my extreme left is Mr. Adit Dobhal, who was one of the coordinators for the publication, and he was also in charge of liaising with the different organizations. So thank you very much, Adit. Again, without Adit, we would have not had this publication. Now, let's begin. This discussion is going to be taking place in a panel format. We thought we would like to give you a flavor of the type of contents that we have in this publication. So what we're going to be doing is addressing 4 different questions. These questions have been horizontal. They are addressed by all the organizations in the publication. And then at the end, we're going to then move a bit to the WTO aspect, so Roberta can tell us a bit how this works in the WTO context. So let's begin with question number 1, which is the following. What is the main objective of your agreement or convention? How has it developed in the past, and what was the rationale behind it? So perhaps if we can begin with Evita, if you can tell us a bit.
Yes.
Tobacco control.
Yes. As you said, Roy, it's a very diverse panel indeed. And I must say that the products that we work with in the 2 agreements that I will be talking about may not be as flashy or as blockbuster in the same sense as, chemical weapons or wild animal poachers. Our product might be as small as this. You might go out on the street, see it every day, and it's something that might be normal, but is more and more getting denormalized. So we deal with tobacco and cigarette products. But in a sense, these products might even be deadlier because these products result in around 8 million deaths worldwide every year and kills up to half of its regular customers. So it kills the customers when it's used exactly as it's intended to be used. So knowing then the deadly nature of these products, countries have come together over 20 years ago to enter into an international agreement called the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, or the WHO FCTC, as we often refer to it. And the objective of this treaty is to protect present and future generations from the harmful adverse effects of tobacco products on health, the economy, the society, and the environment. And recognizing further that illicit trade in tobacco products undermines these tobacco control policies, these same parties to the WHO FCTC entered into another a subsequent agreement under the FCTC called the Protocol to Eliminate Illicit Trade in Tobacco Products, which builds on a provision in the WHO FCTC that aims to address the problem of illicit trade in tobacco products, because it threatens not only health, but also national security and government revenue for countries. So it's not just a public health problem, but it goes beyond that. So just to note that the WHO FCTC, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, is one of the most widely embraced treaties in the world. It currently has 183 parties, whereas the Protocol to Eliminate Illicit Trade has 67 parties to date.
Thank you very much, Evita. Perhaps if we now move to the other side to Pavel.
Thank you very much, Roy. So my name is Pavel Pachta, and since I'm taking the floor for the first time, I would like very much to thank the organizers. I would like very much to thank the World Trade Organization and its secretariat for really preparing this document and to looking into this issue. And it's a really great honor for us to collaborate with WTO and to be here also present in this meeting of the panel. Now, the question you asked is, what are the main objectives of the drug control treaties? So the objective of the drug control treaties, you mentioned that there are some goods which have dual character, so dual use goods. And indeed, the narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances are really this type of goods. They may be, some of them, very, very useful in medicine and must be available in billions of daily doses for medical use. But on the other hand, maybe even the same substances or some other substances are very dangerous, may cause harm, because people may can get addicted. As we say now, they may develop the substance use disorder. And with respect to some substances, it may lead even to overdose and to death. So that's the problem of those substances. And the objective of these treaties is from the beginning to limit their use to medical and scientific purposes. So I think this is the paradigm of the international drug control treaties, to limit the use of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances to medical and scientific purposes. And of course, the international drug control has developed, so there is also control of so-called precursor chemicals, which are used in the illicit manufacture of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. And there is again the intention of the treaties, of the parties to the treaties, to monitor movement of such goods and to prevent their diversion and their use for these illicit purposes. If you ask me how this all has developed, well, we are really a very already old system of control. The international drug control started, let us say, from a meeting which took place in Shanghai in 1909. It was called Shanghai Opium Commission, and that meeting put together the main powers of that time, and they discussed the drug issue. Why in China? You of course remember from history books that in the 19th century, China was really threatened and really confronted with a big problem of opium abuse, and that's a topic in a way which we may to some extent relate also later in this meeting when we will be speaking about free trade, etc. So that was the meeting. Other countries already acknowledged the problem. 1912 was signed the first treaty, International Opium Convention that was at The Hague in the Netherlands. That treaty was endorsed by the Versailles Peace Conference after the First World War. And then in the time between the wars, there were some other agreements and protocols, 1925 Convention referring to dangerous drugs, 1936 Convention to suppress illicit traffic in dangerous drugs. After the Second World War, the mechanism was taken over from the League of Nations by the United Nations, and then developed such an intention to somewhat unify all these treaties and protocols in some kind of new document. And that was developed, and this is the so-called Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which was signed in 1961. So this is first new convention signed after the war. Well, the idea that this will be the only convention for this type of substances didn't materialize. Already in 10 years, the governments have to sign another convention, the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, dealing mainly with chemically produced substances by pharmaceutical industry. And in 1988 was signed the UN Convention against illicit traffic in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. In between, in 1972, governments have modified, have amended the 1961 Convention. So now we have the body of international drug control treaties, 3 conventions: 1961 Convention dealing with narcotic drugs, 1971 with psychotropic substances, and 1988 Convention against illicit traffic with narcotic drugs, psychotropic substances. Almost universal accession to these conventions. For example, the last convention, 1988 convention, has 191 parties. I think this is basically what I will ask: what is the objective? How it has developed? What was behind it? That's really interest of public health, interest of health of individuals, interest of public health for the society. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavel. What I find the most interesting is even 100 years ago, they were still having similar problems to the ones we're still facing today. No? Now we move to Sophie. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to this book and to be part of the panel today. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in the WTO and see many friendly faces. I've been speaking at the Committee on Trade and Environment a few times in the past few years, so it's great to be back. I'd like to first ask a question that I'd leave you with during this panel, and perhaps we can come back to it in the discussion at the end, because a few people that I met here said, "Wow, trade and wildlife, that should, what's that? And I hope you're doing everything you can to stop that." Whereas others will say, who can have anything against trade? I mean, trade's a good thing. So I think it's kind of interesting for you to have in your mind, is trade in wild animals and plants a good thing, or is it not a good thing? And perhaps you'll be a little bit wiser after this little presentation of mine. So like others, I'd give you a little bit of background where CITES is coming from and what it's trying to do. The convention, full title, Convention of International Trade in Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, aims to ensure that international trade in any product or good made of or containing wild animals or plants does not threaten the survival of the species in the wild. In other words, that we consume and trade biodiversity in a sustainable manner so we can continue to do so. That's the aim of this convention. It was negotiated in the 60s. So initially in 62 and 63, different conferences under the auspices of the International Union for Nature Conservation, also known as IUCN, suggested that there was a need for such an agreement and launched negotiations in that sort of sphere. Then come 1972, which you also spoke about, where we had the United Nations Conference on Human Environment in Stockholm. And at this conference, it was agreed that these negotiations should come to an end and that a conference should be convened as soon as possible to adopt the convention. This conference was convened in 1973 in Washington, with about 80 countries present that adopted the convention, and 21 of them signed it on the 3rd of March, 73. exactly 50 years ago, which we have been celebrating this year and will continue to celebrate until we get to 75, when the convention entered into force. Today we have as many parties as the other conventions, almost universal membership with 184 parties. I think as same as you, 187 and 181. So we're conventions that are quite that are benefiting from the support, almost global support, and all major economies are a party to CITES, and I think most of the WTO members as well. In the preamble of the convention itself, which is actually quite interesting given when you think of how old this convention is, it recognizes the need for protecting wild fauna and flora as irreplaceable parts of the natural systems of the earth for future generations. We're in early 70s here. It recognizes the economic, recreational, scientific, and cultural values of plants and animals, and the need to protect species against overexploitation through international trade. It also recognizes that each country is best placed to protect its own wildlife or its own biodiversity, and it's not for others to decide, how to protect it. Each country is best placed, but if you do trade internationally, there are some rules that need to be followed. So today, CITES accords varying degrees of protection to more than 40,000 species of animals and plants. And some of these are actually quite significantly traded, either as live specimens, such as pets, or as part or derived products. For instance, we have over 600 tree species in the convention, and some of them are actually really commercially traded, both from the African continent and the Latin American continent, and also from Asia. There are several hundred species of sharks and rays, as well as other marine animals, and many plants, and these are all used for food, medicinal purposes, furniture, etc. There are very many different varied uses of what we are regulating trade in under CITES, which makes it an interesting convention because we have so many different interfaces with many different economic sectors, which I will get back to. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I've noticed that all of you wanted to say that you have the most ratifications, but I haven't really checked. We will do that at the end. Vania, you're next.
Great, thank you. Now I can say that we do have the most ratification with 193 states parties. Hello, and thank you all for being here. And thank you, Roy, for the introduction and to the WTO for inviting us. My name is Vanya, and I'm a legal officer in the Office of the Legal Advisor at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is the implementing body of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling, and Use of Chemical Weapons and on their destruction. So if there was a time limit, my time would be over. But
you have won already the longest name of the convention. You have won.
Yes. Longest name of the convention, and what it tells you about the convention is how comprehensive the ban on chemical weapons is. You're not just banning use. And when you look at other weapons of mass destruction, like, for example, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, then it's non-proliferation, which is addressed in the treaty. Or like the Biological Weapons Convention, which has somewhat a similar title, but does not have an implementing body like the OPCW. So, I mean, why the ban on chemical weapons came about is important also because weapons in general are not banned. So this is not something that's common or understood. And it arose from the First World War, which is where, in fact, the chemical weapons were used in the largest scale. And because a lot of it was dependent on trench warfare, which made it easy to use gas, for example, if you were using it against enemy troops, so to speak. But it wasn't till the Conference of Disarmament after the Second World War that the negotiations started for a treaty that would ban chemical weapons. So why the ban? There are different theories on it. One is that chemical weapons are just not very effective weapons. It's very reliant on, for example, wind direction. So if you do blow gas on enemy troops and the direction of the wind changes, you could be the victim of the same chemical that we're using to attack. And also, there's a cynical theory that says we just have better weapons. Nuclear weapons were developed and the need for chemical weapons maybe wasn't felt anymore. But the fact is that it is still a great achievement of the international community to have concluded the Chemical Weapons Convention, which entered into force in 1997. And then it became the first international treaty to ban an entire category of weapons of mass destruction under international verification and control. And that is a big achievement. So to also say that international disarmament is obviously a goal of the CWC. That's one of the major goals, but it's not the only one. You also have matters related to non-proliferation, plus the prevention of reemergence, but also promoting the use of chemistry for peaceful purposes. And all of this relates to the trade-related aspects of the convention, because when we talk about export controls and trade in relation to the Chemical Weapons Convention, we're not talking about control of trade in chemical weapons. There is no international trade in chemical weapons. Chemical weapons are absolutely banned under the convention. So one of the first things that acceding states parties undertake when they join the convention is to never transfer directly or indirectly to anybody any chemical weapons. But also, as we know, that any chemical can become a weapon. So the alternate to this would have been, if you had no control whatsoever of the international trade in chemicals, it would be banning either chemical trade in chemicals in its entirety, or trying to figure out mechanisms for how they can be controlled while also maintaining and promoting the object and purpose of the convention. So the trade-related aspects of the convention actually deal with the trade in toxic chemicals. And these are only certain chemicals which are actually listed within the convention. And so just because I use the term chemical weapons a lot, I just want to say that there is a kind of intuitive understanding of what a chemical weapon is. When I use the term, I think mostly, and I ask this question often to visiting professionals and students, and you would say gas or something like an actual chemical. But under the convention, that's only one aspect of a chemical weapon. Yes, that is a chemical weapon, but under the convention, the devices and munitions that are released, that are used for the release of that toxic gas is independently considered a chemical weapon. Then third, any equipment which is used to employ the device or munition that is used to release the toxic gas is also considered a chemical weapon. So all three of these, the chemical, the munitions and devices, and the equipment are independently and separately considered chemical weapons under the convention. So when you have destruction obligations, it's not only in relation to the toxic chemical itself, but it's also in relation to the munitions and devices which have been used to employ these weapons. So again, quite comprehensive, and I look forward to discussing the trade-related aspects of it as well.
Thank you. So again, you can see very, very diverse type of issues that have been regulated through international cooperation. And these are only 4 of the, I don't remember exactly, I think we have 13, 14 different agreements which have been considered in the publication in this type of areas. No? So these are just examples of what you're able to find in the book. Let's now get a bit more into the substance. So in my introduction, I was explaining to you why you need international cooperation, why you need the exporting country to also cooperate in the enforcement of some form of controls to be able to make sure that you actually achieve the objectives like the ones you have heard before. So let's get into the details. Now, how does it work in practice? So why is it that regulating export was considered to be important for your agreements? And what kind of tools? We noticed a lot of licenses, permits, prohibitions are also used by them. So there are some commonalities despite the diversity of the issues. And how do you know if the parties are really complying with the obligations you have in your agreements? So perhaps, well, Vanya, since I can see you're very energized. So let's continue with you.
So to talk more about the export-related provisions, so maybe to provide a bit of context, the Chemical Weapons Convention, I mean, it's only, that's it, that is the convention. It has 3 annexes, the Annex on Chemicals, the Verification Annex, and the Confidentiality Annex. And the Annex on Chemicals contains essentially a list of chemicals, and they are organized into schedules, Schedule 1, 2, and 3, in decreasing order of risk to the object and purpose of the convention. So for example, Schedule 1 chemicals are those which pose the highest risk to the object and purpose of the convention. They usually include nerve agents like sarin, which have historically very little known use for any purpose that is not prohibited under the convention. So in terms of these annexes, and because there is a list of chemicals in this convention, a lot of people believe or are confused into thinking that those are the only chemicals which are banned as weapons by the convention. But this is not the case. Like I said, any chemical can become a weapon. Chlorine, for example, historically has been known to be used as a weapon, and it is not listed in the annex on chemicals. So what this annex on chemicals is for is application of what we in the OPCW call verification measures. We have an entire division called the inspectorate, which verifies both destruction of chemical weapons, but also chemical industry to see that there is no reemergence and that states are using the chemicals that they're producing them for legitimate means. And these are the specific chemicals which are verified by the organization. And in terms of the export restrictions and controls, they were, like I said, you could have legitimate uses for certain chemicals, and there are purposes mentioned within the convention which are considered legitimate, which is research, medical, pharmaceutical, protective purposes, etc. So to not stop the trade in chemicals entirely, what is done is that you verify both the transfer of this chemical, so the export of these chemicals, as well as the import of the chemicals. So, for example, if you have a transfer for a Schedule 1 chemical, there are certain conditions attached to it. For example, states parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention are not allowed under the convention to transfer any Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 chemical to a state that is not party to the convention. So you can only have transfers of Schedule 1 and 2 chemicals between two states parties. And also there are quantitative restrictions on how much you can transfer. There's also use restrictions. What is the purpose that you can transfer for? And for Schedule 3 chemicals, because they also have large scale industry application, the control restrictions are fewer. So what the OPCW does is we receive declarations from states parties. States parties are required to declare what are the chemicals within the annex of chemicals that they are transferring, who they are transferring them to. And then we receive declarations from the importing states that say what are the chemicals that they have accepted into their territory and how. And so by kind of monitoring, compliance monitoring is also done by checking basically these two, the due declarations. And often we find discrepancies, and in which case OPCW negotiates with the two states parties to figure out how the discrepancy has arisen and what are the causes for it. And sometimes, of course, there could be legitimate reasons, while others it could be an issue of transfer. And in terms of what are the control prohibitions and use, of course, prohibition is one for chemical weapons, but also licenses and permits. But usually that's left to the states themselves because the obligation under the convention is usually on the states parties. So how they want to restrict or implement their obligations under the convention is left to them. And then, but they do have notification and declaration obligations in relation to the technical secretariat of the OPCW.
Thank you very, very much, Vania. So what I find interesting is you have this kind of risk assessment type of issue in customs. We also use that term quite frequently, but I guess in a very different way. And then you manage the risk. The higher the risk, then the higher type of controls you need to have, no? Perhaps since it's more or less related, Pavel, if you can tell us how does it work in the narcotics area?
Okay, thank you very much. So first part of your question, why is the regulation of export imports important under drug control? As we have mentioned, the objective of the treaties is to limit the use of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances to medical and scientific purposes. And the treaty also says, by the same time, that the governments have to ensure that these substances will be available for these purposes. So there is also a kind of double objective of the international drug control treaties. And as a result of it, there is a very large international trade by pharmaceutical industry, a lot of narcotics, a lot of psychotropic substances going from one country to another country. So it's an immense trade of these controlled substances. Now, if we want to prevent diversion from this illicit manufacture and illicit trade into illicit traffic for illicit uses under this convention, as Roy mentioned already in his starting speech, we need to control the supply chain from the manufacturer to the consumer, to the user, in fact. And many of these movements, diversion may take place already in the manufacturing factory. Some part of the manufacture of morphine, for example, may be stolen and sold to the illicit market. Or at the end of the chain is the doctor who is prescribing narcotic drugs, for example. He may be prescribing somebody a lot, and he will be using it to sell in the illicit market. Or even the patient, the last one in the chain, may sell. He receives buprenorphine, for example, in the substitution treatment of his addiction, substance use disorder, and he may be selling part of these products on the illicit market to get additional money. So everywhere may be diversion, and you have to take action against this diversion. And of course, for the states, it is easier to implement these controls at the national level. The convention prescribes licensing, record keeping, recording, inspection, sanctions for violation of some rules. So you have in your hand the control of prevention of diversion at your national level. However, then you have international trade, and this is an area where a lot of diversion from illicit manufacture and trade in the past has taken place with respect to narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances, and that's an area where also chemicals, which are now used for the illicit manufacture of drugs, are also diverted for these uses. So international trade is really a very, very important key area, which has been targeted by drug traffickers to obtain these substances from illicit manufacture for illicit use. Now, which tools are being used to prevent it? It has developed historically. We are a node control system, so we have already some historical experience. And if, for example, in 1925, the governments introduced to control international trade, the import and export authorizations for international trade, then they hoped that they will have some control of international trade. You have the obligation, if you want to export, you have to obtain first the export authorization from the competent authority of your country. And to obtain such authorization, you must present to this competent authority the import certificate, which was issued by the competent authorities in the importing country. So you have this type of control. But what happened what kind of problem appeared already in the 1920s, 1930s? Falsified, forged import certificates. At the time, people were using forged import certificates, and myself, in my career some 30 years ago in the UN, in the control of drugs, I was confronted with these cases when European countries were exporting amphetamines to Africa. Then reporting it to the International Narcotics Control Board. They were exporting in large quantities, and then we learned from the importing countries there was no import of these drugs. They have never authorized such imports. So falsified import authorizations have been used. How you can work against it? So the international community already before the war started for narcotic drugs with this so-called system of estimates of legitimate requirements of countries for illicit substances. So countries estimate how much they may need. Countries send this information to the International Narcotics Control Board. Board is considering whether this is appropriate or not, and then the board so-called confirms and publishes these estimates. Exporting countries know it, and now if they know that the importing country needs 1 kilo of amphetamine per year, so if somebody would like to export 500 kilos, it's already suspicious, even if she submits an import permit. So this is like after the import-export controls by permits started the moment of estimates of importing countries of quantities they need for legitimate purposes. There's, of course, a lot of flexibility in it because countries may change it if their medical needs are increasing, for example. This is no strict quota, something, but yeah, for you, if you look at it from the WTO perspective, it's kind of quantitative restriction for trade. Pharmaceutical industry will know that to this country they may export only 5 kilos of amphetamine per year, not more. So that's another mechanism. And of course, finally, how do you know that parties comply? The conventions put also reporting requirements on countries. So they report to the International Narcotics Control Board on their imports and exports. The board gets this information, the board can confirm easily this information, and they identify discrepancies and then go into these discrepancies and find out whether there has been any diversion or whether there has been some problems in the national control system. So this is the system for international trade. International trade is for us the key area where most diversion in the past has been taking place, and therefore it is necessary to control international trade. And the system of control has been developing. We have some controls in the past, and it has been developing and will be probably also in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Ren.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Perhaps if we go now to Evita, if you can tell how does it work for you?
Yes. Okay, but before I answer the question, Roy, can you please let me correct myself with the number of parties that I told Sophie? It's 183 for the FCTC. I did not want to lose sleep over it. So thank you. Okay, so now I would like to answer the question. So why is it important to regulate the export of tobacco products? As I said earlier, these products are inherently deadly. So it would be very important to regulate the export, and a lot of the trade happens between, a lot of tobacco trade happens between countries. So the measures that we have under the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control are, they can be categorized into measures to reduce the demand for tobacco products and to reduce the supply for tobacco products. So under those demand reduction measures, you would have measures like packaging and labeling measures, measures to raise tobacco prices by increasing tobacco taxes, measures to regulate the contents and emissions of tobacco products. And then for the supply reduction provisions, you would have measures like banning the sale of tobacco products to minors, or measures to address illicit trade. So the implementation of these demand and supply reduction measures could significantly affect export regulations depending on the national legislation of these countries. But I thought I could elaborate a little bit more on the measures under the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products, because here we see very specific measures that would expressly apply to exporters of tobacco products, as well as tobacco and manufacturing equipment. And I'll give you a few examples of the measures under this protocol. So in the protocol, we have obligations for parties to adopt measures to establish a licensing system or an equivalent approval system. So under the protocol, countries would have to ensure that those entities engaged in the supply chain, those exporters of tobacco products, and manufacturing equipment would have to avail of a license and submit necessary information, necessary documents such as their corporate papers, tax records, their manufacturing facilities, export facilities, who their customers are, these kinds of information to secure the tobacco supply chain and to make sure that the tobacco products would not be diverted into illicit channels. So that's one measure. Another measure, which is a very important part of the protocol, is a tracking and tracing regime, or a system that parties are required to adopt for cigarettes and tobacco products. So in this tracking and tracing system, you would have tobacco manufacturers, the tobacco industry would be required to put unique identification markings, which should be tamper-proof, should not be removable from the packaging of tobacco products. And this would enable countries that they are exporting to make sure, upon inspecting the unique identification markings on the pack, to make sure that whether taxes have been paid, where this product originated from, how this product has been moving across the supply chain, what is the legal status of this product. So measures just to secure the tobacco supply chain, to make sure that they do not they are not diverted into the black market. And then there are other measures in the protocol, such as due diligence requirements. So exporters would be required to make sure that to know their customers, to make sure that they are also dealing with legitimate enterprises, and they would not the products would not fall into the black market. There are also information sharing requirements, record keeping requirements, and so on. So a number of more stringent requirements that would apply to exporters of tobacco products. Then the question, how do we deal with, or how do we know if parties are complying with the measures? So for both the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and the Protocol to Eliminate Illicit Trade in Tobacco Products, we have reporting mechanisms, similarly with other conventions, that are integrated in the international agreement. So every 2 years, parties must report to the Convention Secretariat as to how they have been implementing each key article of both the Framework Convention and the Protocol to Eliminate Illicit Trade in Tobacco Products. And then we at the Convention Secretariat would distill and report on these reports by the parties in our global progress reports on implementation.
Thank you very much, Evita. So you can see the three of them pretty complicated. So Sophie, are you more complicated than that or no?
Yes and no. The convention itself is very straightforward. It's only 25 articles. It doesn't have a long title, and it's very simple, and it has held its ground for 50 years. It has been amended twice, but small amendments to do with budget and to allow the European Union to become a party. Otherwise, it has stayed as it was negotiated and adopted 50 years ago. However, we do amend it every 3 years because species are being added or deleted from the 3 appendices, but I will come back to that. But the convention itself is very simple. And having said that, we have about 100 different resolutions that help parties actually apply and interpret and implement the convention. So you can keep it simple if you can explain elsewhere what each term mean, which is what parties have done. So I want to go back to the question which is why is regulation of trade in wild animals and plants important? Well, of course, it's important to ensure that these species don't go extinct. And it's also important to note that most of the species that are found in international trade are not endangered, but trade needs to be monitored and regulated to ensure that they don't become endangered. And that's the whole purpose of the convention. It's not intended to stop trade. It's not intended to promote trade. It's intended to regulate trade so that the resources are there also for future generations. As what you may not know is that annually international trade in wild animals and plants are estimated to be worth billions of dollars and include hundreds of millions of plants and animals. And how do I know this? Because parties do have a reporting requirement, much like my predecessor. We actually require every party to every year submit a detailed report on what they have exported, which specimens, which type of product, which species, how much, from where to where, for which purpose. And they do submit these reports. So we have a trade database from the beginning of the convention, which today holds over 150,000 aggregated records of trade that has occurred in that period. Is a really, really interesting place to look for information about your country. What is it my country trading, to where, what for. The only thing we don't have today is the value of the trade. We don't ask for that, but it would be interesting in the future to also ask for that. So trade is very diverse, as I mentioned before, live animals, live plants. Did you know that all orchids are actually included in CITES? So about 30,000 of the species of the 40,000 species are orchid species. And they are included whether or not they are taken from the wild or produced in a horticulture center. Except that if you can see that it's a artificially propagated plant, you have some exemptions, but in principle, they are covered as well. And international trade and all the pressures that we see on animals and plants today, you know, international trade is only one of those, and you have to consider this in these contexts. We spoke about poaching, and I will come back to that. Climate change, habitat loss, all of these things put pressure on biodiversity and may bring species on the brink of extinction, but it's not only international trade that would be the course of that. And I also wanted to mention that while we talk about the pressures on biodiversity, it's important to note that international trade can be contribute to conservation if it's well managed, of course, and monitored. Because if local communities can see that there is an economic value with the species that they live with, they will protect them and they will make sure that these species do not go extinct. But of course, that requires that there is collaboration at the local level, the national level, at the international level, so that this trade can be well managed and take place at a level that is sustainable. And one example that we often refer back to is the vicuña, which is a species that lives in the Andes mountains that was at the brink of extinction in 1970s and 75. It was included as one of the endangered species. And then the international and the local community said, let's try to figure out a way to manage this better. And today it has a very healthy population where the local communities benefit from the fibers that are luxury fibers that can be sold internationally, with the help of the importing countries to ensure that it's completely well monitored and managed. So I'm running out of time here. What are the tools that we use in CITES to ensure that that trade is well managed, it's legal and it's sustainable? I think there are many, but I'd like to highlight just 6 now. First of all, it's a legally binding treaty, and it has a set of common minimum standard for this international trade of the species that are included in the convention. Second, it covers all import, all export, but also re-export, and also introduction from the sea, which means anything that's taken in the high seas beyond the natural jurisdiction of any country. And so it's quite comprehensive in that sense. And third is the CITES permit system, which is the backbone of the regulation of trade. It's a bit like what my predecessors have spoken about. We have CITES permits and certificates that can only be issued if the conditions for authorizing trade are fulfilled. And these conditions are that the trade must be legal. So the specimens that are in trade must have been legally acquired, and there is an obligation to check that they have been taken in accordance with national legislation. It must be sustainable, so there is a requirement to ensure that it's not hampering or impacting the survival of the species in the wild. And we must know exactly where it comes from, so it has to be traceable back to where it was taken in the wild. And these assessments or verification that the conditions have been fulfilled must be made by officially designated authorities in each country. So each country has to designate at least one management authority to issue permit and one scientific authority to verify that the science is sound. And these are sort of officially mentioned on our website. Anybody can go and find out who can issue these permits. As I mentioned before, we have a set of appendices. We have 3, a bit like others have talked about schedules. So the Appendix 1 is comprised of species that are endangered and cannot be traded for commercial purposes. There's only about 3% of the species in this appendix, but it includes the iconic animals that you know of, big cats, elephants, whales, etc. Some rare cacti as well, actually. And then we have Appendix 2, which include all the, 97% of the species that we are regulating are included in Appendix 2. For instance, I mentioned sharks and rays, trees, orchids, birds, etc. And then there is an Appendix 3, which is where parties can unilaterally put species on that are not globally threatened, but that they think that it would be good to get a little more international collaboration around these. So these are the 3 appendices that, as I said, are amended every 3 years when we have our meeting of the Conference of the Parties. And then finally, I wanted to mention the compliance monitoring that is quite strong in the context of CITES, both from a legal and from a scientific perspective. We have a good system to monitor that trade is in compliance with the rules of the convention. And we have a good system to actually discuss this at every meeting and have a system whereby the parties can agree that a recommendation to not trade with a particular party on a particular species should be put in place to preserve that species and make sure that it's legal and sustainable going forward. And just one more final thing, because we are such a small convention, we are only about 30 people in the Secretariat. I think one of our strengths is our ability to forge partnerships, and CITES has many important partnerships with both UN organizations such as UNCTAD, who's here in the room. We have FAO. We work with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and Drugs and Crime. And as well as many other international organizations, WTO, WCO, etc., but also many local organizations and NGOs, as well as our parties, of course. And I think that has helped the convention to be as strong as it is today and as effective as it is. So these partners, I think, are really crucial to the effectiveness of the convention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So as I was saying before, very different objectives, all of them very important, many similarities, but also some differences, which I think in the publication, you're going to be able to see all the details for all these different conventions. I'm just very mindful of the time. So perhaps now I tried to give you a lot of time for these other sections. I'm going to give you less time for the next ones. Perhaps if you can tell me in 1 minute, if you can, what are some of the new developments with respect to some of these new challenges we're facing in trade? We're facing new challenges. I imagine you're also facing new challenges in your areas. So perhaps if we begin with you, Pavel.
Thank you very much. So new challenges. I would perhaps start with a challenge which has been here already historically, but is in fact, unfortunately, is now repeated more frequently, and that are emergencies. You know, emergency situations, even either caused by the nation, either caused by the nature. That means like the earthquake now in Morocco or the floodings in Libya. So terrible things which happen in these countries, and or caused by people themselves, and there are all these military conflicts which take place now. So in these emergencies, people need controlled substances. People need controlled substances, and it is necessary that the emergency supplies of these substances get to them. They are, you know, some of the controlled substances are even in the list of essential drugs of the World Health Organization, like morphine, like diazepam. You may need diazepam because of the stress and after the earthquake, and so you need, of course, morphine because of pain, etc. In injuries, you need phenobarbital. So there are some essential drugs in these kits, and then there is, of course, a problem how to comply with all these comprehensive controls in these critical situations of emergencies. So in that case, of course, International Narcotics Control Board and other related organizations were thinking of it already in the past. So we have guidelines developed in particular in cooperation with the World Health Organization, guidelines for dealing with this emergency situation. So in the emergency situations, all the responsibility for control is now not with the importing country, which is under stress, but the control measures must be applied only by the exporting country. Exporting country takes the responsibility that the narcotic drugs will go with the right people to the country of an earthquake, for example, and also the quota. So the importing country, the so-called quotas, the estimates do not apply. If they need now much more morphine, so fine, the exporting country will supply this morphine to the importing country. So emergencies, unfortunately, that's one of the important developments. Then we have digitalization. We try to go also with this space of digitalization. We are exchanging so many documents. In the past, it was in the paper form. Now we want to establish platforms, and we want to establish some templates, standard templates, and enable electronic exchange of information. So we have one platform for the exchange of import and export authorizations between countries immediately in electronic form. And we have another platform for precursor chemicals where the control is not so stringent, and when the obligation is only to provide importing countries with pre-export notifications. So, but there is already for a relatively almost 20 years in force the so-called PAN online system. So pre-export notifications online system where countries very quickly exchange through the platform established and you know, administered by INCB these notifications that these chemicals which may be used for illicit manufacture are being exported. I think I managed these two. Yes, that's I could edit more, but yes, these are much.
If it were for me, we will stay here the whole day, but we have to continue. Perhaps now, if we continue now with Vanya. I guess some of them might be similar, like the digitalization aspect, no?
Yeah. Oh, no, we're very far behind on that, actually. But there have been many explosive developments in the chemical disarmament sector, so to speak. And the most important of which was, I don't know if any of you have read that in the news, but there was 100% completion of destruction of all declared stockpiles of chemical weapons as recently as July 2023, when the United States, which was the last possessor state of declared chemical weapons, completed the destruction of its stockpile. So as of this moment, from all the states parties that we have and which have declared chemical weapons, the 100% completed. Does that mean the mandate of the OPCW is over? Clearly not, because there have been allegations of undeclared chemical weapons by, states parties. And there have also been allegations of chemical weapons use, which is, of course, egregious for the purpose of the convention. But one interesting development that I do want to talk about, and what I thought interesting in Sophie's statement that the CITES secretary, like the convention is amended every 3 years, the appendices, is that the Annex on Chemicals has only been amended once. And that was in 2019, after the, attacks in the UK in 2018, the Salisbury attack and the Amesbury attack. So the need was felt to add a category of chemicals to the Schedule 1 of the Annex on Chemicals. And the Annex had never been amended till that time. And that is because the Annex does not control the definition of a chemical weapon. It doesn't matter if a chemical is in the Annex or not. It's only relevant for purposes of verification. But because Schedule 1 contains nerve agents and the like, which have pretty much no purpose other than those which are prohibited under the convention, and this sort of family of chemicals, the so-called Novichoks, were added to the Annex in 2019 on the basis of two proposals tabled by states parties. One was tabled by the United States, Canada, and the Netherlands, and the second was tabled by the Russian Federation. And both these proposals were adopted by consensus by the Conference of the States Parties, which is the plenary, all 193 states parties. And this was the first time that the Annex on Chemicals was amended to add any chemicals. And that means that after the amendment, transfer obligations and export-related controls applied to these chemicals as well, which had not previously been the case. So the convention retains that sort of the promise of being amended, of being fit for purpose in the future as well, because it can always be amended to add new chemicals and kind of create a different regime for existing chemicals.
Thank you very much, Vanya. Perhaps Sophie?
Yes, in 1 minute it's going to be hard, but I like my neighbor here, we are working on e-permitting in the CITES context. As I said, the convention was negotiated in the 60s and 70s, and that time it was considered easy to have a paper permit in 4 copies that would go with a package across the world and be stamped by every customs as it traveled. Of course, that's not how trade happens today, and you know that much better than I do. So now we're looking at how to do this completely paperless and with perhaps QR codes and whatever, making a system that's possible to be used both by those who want to persist with paper and those who do not want to. So that's a very important development. It's not new, but it's only been really picking up now, in particular in the wake of COVID, where it was not really possible to work with papers. The second thing I wanted to talk about is, of course, illegal trade, because that's not really sort of strictly speaking in the mandate of the convention. We don't have poaching and illegal trade and wildlife crime, etc. But it's of course very, very important nowadays, where we understand that this illegal trade actually contributes to the depletion of some of the species, or perhaps even bringing some of them to extinction, such as the elephant or the rhino, because of the value of the horn and the tusk. So we have a lot of collaboration, a lot of focus on illegal trade and poaching. And I'm very happy to say that since this monitoring of illegal killing of elephants started in 2011, we're actually seeing a consistent downward trend in terms of elephants being poached for their ivory, in particular in Africa. And so that's something that's a good news. It's every year we collect data, we can see how elephants died, and we can see whether they still have their ivory, and we can then with certainty say that elephants are not being poached as much as they were for their ivory. So that's the second. And the third thing, which is also a bit linked to what you were mentioning, is the emergencies. because what do we do when there is an emergency situation? Could be a earthquake, could be a war, could be a pandemic, and nobody is there to look after animals, and nobody's there to look after animals that are in captivity and they need to be transferred somewhere, but nobody's there to actually do the paperwork. And that's something we're starting to look at right now. And this is linked to a general concern in some parts of the world with animal welfare, with wild animals that are in captivity, and actually the production of wild animals for pets. For instance, there were several places where they actually do produce wild birds, reptiles, iguanas, etc., for people to have as pets. And there are some that are saying, well, should that happen? There are some saying that we shouldn't have wild animals in circuses, we shouldn't have wild animals in zoos. So there are some concerns around the welfare of wild animals in captivity that, of course, impacts our convention as well. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Perhaps Evita, on your side?
1 minute, I promise. So the FCTC, it was negotiated over 20 years ago. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary now. So you can imagine that at the time that the treaty was being negotiated, we did not have yet these novel and emerging tobacco products that are now in the market. We did not have those heated tobacco products. You might know them as heat sticks, specially designed mini cigarettes that are meant to be used with a device, supposedly smoke-free. We did not have electronic cigarettes. So you have all of these new and emerging tobacco and nicotine products out in the market that are, of course, also harmful to health, as evidence shows. And worse, they are for the nicotine products, they could serve as a gateway to smoking and further tobacco addiction as well. So these are areas that were not existing then at the time of treaty negotiation, but are, of course, for heated tobacco products, which would fall under the definition of tobacco products in the convention. They would fall within the ambit of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. As for electronic cigarettes, the governing body of the treaty, which is the Conference of the Parties to the FCTC, has also issued decisions providing for recommended policy actions and policy options for states, such as encouraging states to consider banning or regulating these kinds of products. So that's an area that is sort of new or developing in the world of the WHO FCTC. And it also is concerning because it presents a regulatory challenge for countries.
Thank you. Keep watching the clock. So perhaps if even faster for the last question we're going to be looking at is, and this one is quite interesting, is to what extent WTO rules are taken into account in your agreements or your discussions between members in your agreements. Perhaps we will begin with you, Sophie.
Yeah, I can say at present, it's not a big extent. But I can also say that at the time the convention was negotiated, the negotiators were conscious of the interlinkages between CITES and GATT, and there were regular sort of interaction between the negotiators and the GATT Secretariat, and they were conscious of GATT Article 13, making sure that the convention would sort of be aligned with the system. And I'm happy to say that over the 50 years that the convention has been in existence, there has not been one single dispute that has has been around the convention and its export restrictions, as it were. We published this together, this publication when WTO turned 20 years in 2015. We did this publication together, which sends the message that the relationship between CITES and WTO in promoting sustainable development has been harmonious and mutually supportive. And I think that still holds today. I think it's one thing I didn't mention in the previous question is that we are now, as the convention is now moving into regulating trade in commodities. So things that are traded extensively, and this is going to put the convention a little bit to a test, because before it was not as much, but now we have timber trade, we have volumes of trade in shark fins, etc. That is huge, and I think that this relationship will perhaps evolve a little bit, given that these many species were added just last year. So we're not seeing it yet, but it will come, that we are actually regulating now commodities, which we were never set up to do, which will put our systems a little bit to a test. So I don't know if I'm making my closing remarks. Are we coming back for closing remarks? I also just want to say not too much about WTO, because I think we have the expert here, and so I think it's better for her to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps now we move to one where we have had a dispute. So I guess we have been mentioned much more in the context of the tobacco control. So Evita.
Yeah, so WTO members that are parties to the WHO FCTC have used the FCTC to justify quantitative restrictions on the import and export of tobacco products. And we have seen 4 notifications that have used the FCTC as a justification for quantitative restrictions on import of products. But we have not yet seen notifications that have used the FCTC as a justification for restrictions on export trade. So the restrictions with respect to tobacco products have focused more on Article 2B of the GATT that deals with the right to protect human health. But on the other hand, the protocol, which envisions tobacco control measures intended to secure the supply chain, that was, as I was mentioning earlier, that would deal more expressly with the regulation of import and export of tobacco products, and manufacturing equipment more specifically. So this, in the future, we may find reference in the notifications to the to the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products. And this is a space to watch because it's a very young treaty. It's only 5 years old, turning 5 this September.
Thank you very much. Vanya, on your side, did you talk about the WTO?
Yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, actually, and this is something we realized maybe working on this publication, was that within the preamble of the Chemical Weapons Convention, the states parties had outlined their desire to promote free trade in chemicals. So that is maybe not one of the things that you think of if you think of chemical disarmament, but actually one of the major aspects of the convention relates to free trade in chemicals. And once a state party joins, when a state becomes party to the convention, they're also required to not maintain restrictions amongst themselves for trade in chemistry, which is related to industrial or pharmaceutical and medical and other peaceful purposes. So one of the reasons that states might want to join the convention is, in fact, that it helps promote trade. Because, like I said, in relation to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 chemicals, states parties cannot transfer those chemicals to states not party. That is an obligation you take under the convention. And lots of states just didn't have any chemical weapons. There are lots of states that are party to the convention which have never declared any chemical weapons. They just didn't have any. So one of the reasons that they joined the convention, one of the major reasons, is the technological and scientific development aspects of it, or the international cooperation aspects of it, or the free trade aspects of it. So we do have like quite a big relationship, I think, with the WTO in that regard. Like, I think it's philosophically. But in terms of notifications, etc., I am sure the WTO sees notifications on quantitative restrictions that apply to chemicals, which states would probably have to notify. But we do not know so much of it because we're not notified of what they're notifying the WTO about. So this publication was actually, and thanks to the WTO for having actually carried it forward, because now we know so much more about like these sort of interlinked dense obligations that were quite in the dark for us. Although the states which implement these obligations probably have a much better idea of it because they do it on the day-to-day, that it is their obligation. And so probably they're the ones fulfilling it, but we ourselves didn't have so much of an idea of it till we now see this in writing. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And Pavel?
Yeah. Thank you. It's a very interesting, let us say, issue, and we may develop some thinking about it. So inspiring. I think anyway, we have to clearly say that we covered 2 distinct areas of global affairs. Drug control covers the issues of prevention of illicit use of narcotics, psychotropics, and to ensure their availability. And so this is our area. The objective is in public health. Your objective is in the trade and the flow of trade, and your rules are dealing with that. So we have 2 sets of rules, but of course there is an overlap. So there is an overlap, and the international pharmaceutical industry and the chemical industry producing precursors is covered by both types of rules. I can imagine theoretically some problems with the application of the provisions of the drug control treaties, which could be applied theoretically by somebody in a discriminatory manner. But this is something theoretical. I'm not aware of any complaints or something in that kind. It may happen in the countries. You have, of course, quotas. You have, of course, the estimates, which represent the maximum quantities to be imported. You have the issuance of import authorizations. So this is everything which has a reference to your rules. So this is the first area where perhaps you may be concerned. The other area where we are concerned, and this is the fact that the objective of the treaties is to ensure the availability of drugs for medical and scientific purposes. The drugs should be available, should be affordable, and then your rules dealing with the patents and with these types of property rights, so intellectual property rights, this might become a problem for the import of some substances into especially low-income countries. So there might be something which may be again relevant for our convention, because we want that drugs are available to the people, that they are affordable, and the countries are very, very much interested in generics and not in very expensive products. So maybe if you have some your TRIPS rules, etc., this may have relevance against for us. So there is definitely some kind of overlap of our rules, and there is a theoretical possibility for some kind of conflict. If there is a conflict, then this is for government, for the authorities to settle these conflicts, having some kind of balance, compromise, finding between the two rules. So very interesting. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Perhaps two takeaways from all these discussions we have been having thus far. One of them is that in many cases, if you want to have trade or more trade, you really need to have this international cooperation to regulate properly how it takes place. And the other one is if you are the exporter of some of these products, it can get pretty complicated for you. Because imagine if you're exporting some of these chemical products that may be used for, I don't know, production of tobacco products or for chemical weapons, and also for narcotic type of products, you need to comply with all the different rules and regulations for all of them, right? But now let's turn very quickly to Roberta, who has been very patiently waiting. If you can tell us a bit in terms of these international agreements in the WTO framework, I mean, how does it work for the WTO, and what type of information has been notified by members?
Thank you very much, Roy. I promise to be as short as possible, but I would also like to thank all the panelists here today for their presentations and for contributing to this book, because I think this is a very good initiative that is trying to bridge the knowledge gap that there is between all these plethora of measures outside there. We have only heard about 4 conventions, but there are more conventions in the book and even more conventions outside, and the relationship with the WTO. So of course, despite the time, I am sure that nobody wants to leave the room until this question is asked and answered probably. So how is it possible that the parties to these conventions, who are also WTO members, if you look at the annex of the book, I feel obliged now to say that the WTO has 164 members. So we are at the bottom of the rank, but so how is it possible that, you know, these members restrict or even prohibit trade in these goods? Isn't the purpose of this own organization to not create obstacles to trade? And so how can these two things be reconciled? And the introduction to the book explains it all. So mindful of the time, I will not enter into the details, but I just wanted to say that, of course, there is one provision in the GATT 1994, which is Article 11, which deals with, of course, export prohibitions and restrictions. And it's, by the way, one of the few provisions in the WTO to deal with export measures. So in the first paragraph of this article, Article 11, says that the members cannot apply any restrictions or prohibition to their trade. But at the same time, of course, we have heard that all these measures that are put in place have very good, they try to achieve very good objectives and legitimate policy objectives. So Article 11 itself, but other provisions in the GATT and in the WTO agreements in general do allow for such flexibility. So members can deviate from this prohibition of course, as an exception and in limited circumstances to achieve their legitimate objectives. So if that is the case, if a member wants to prohibit export of weapons that can cause mass destructions, of course, they can do it. So what it becomes very much important is transparency. Transparency is another important principle of this house. And so what is important is that members share information about these measures. This is important for traders because, as Roy was saying, those that have to comply with all these regulations, they need to know what are the conditions that they have to fulfill if they want to export these goods. And also among the members themselves, because the delegates that sit in the Committee on Market Access, they mainly come from the Ministry of Trade or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Probably these conventions at the national level, they are administered by other ministries, by other government agencies, and sometimes communication can also be difficult. So there is a decision in the context of the WTO, which is the decision for the notification of QRs, which requires WTO members to notify these measures to the WTO. And I don't want to enter into the detail of the QR decision, of course. I just wanted to give you a flavor of what type of information can be found. So already in the book, you have a few data. So far, yes, 85 members of the WTO have notified their quantitative restrictions to the WTO. When we talk about quantitative restrictions here, we mean any type of restrictions or prohibitions to both import and exports. These account for about, 2,406 measures, covering import and export, of course, but and the majority of notified measures has to do with imports, but there are also many export measures. And so the QR decision becomes one of the main channel to share this information at the WTO. And then so looking at the products that are affected by these restrictions based on the information notified. So the category of products that is mostly affected by restrictions is chemicals. So we have the winner in this podium, different type of chemicals, of course. And members also are requested to justify the reason for introducing such type of restrictions or prohibitions. And of course, they have to cite the GATT or the WTO legal provision that they consider would allow them to deviate from the general rule of not applying such restrictions or prohibitions. And when it's the case that these measures are implemented because they are implementing international conventions, they also have to indicate which conventions are they implementing. So what is the most cited international conventions based on WTO notifications? Again, we have the winner of the podium, and the most cited conventions is CITES, followed by the type of, environmental related conventions like Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, who deal, of course, with chemicals, trading chemicals products. We also have narcotics. So WTO members, they do provide information to the Committee on Market Access through this decision. But of course, we also have to acknowledge that there is a gap that still exists in this information. And of course, the situation can be improved. So how is this book useful? I think, that this is useful precisely so that everybody has a better understanding of what these conventions entails, what does it mean in terms of trade, what are the measures that the members are applying, and what is known at the level of the WTO, how is transparency performing in this context, and how we could do better to improve transparency in these measures. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberta. So the book, which I forgot to show it at the beginning, is in fact a dual use type of product as well. No, so we wanted to use it to coordinate amongst the different organizations, but we also wanted to use it for purposes of trying to improve at the WTO the information that we have in here. Again, I'm very mindful of the time. Thank you very much, Roberta, for this. I don't know if perhaps some of the other organizations which are here with us would like to say something. Would you like to say something? No? Okay, then if not, perhaps we can now go to the closing. So I will just give you not 1 minute, 30 seconds to see if you would like to begin. Perhaps, Evita, you would like to begin?
Yes, well, to draw this session to a close for me, I think I would just like to echo actually something that you said at the start of the session, Roy, when you said that international cooperation is not something that's nice to have, but an absolute necessity. This is very true for the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and the Protocol to Eliminate Illicit Trade in Tobacco Products, because the success of these two treaties would be largely dependent on how well countries can work together.
Thank you very much, Vanya.
Well, thank you for inviting me as a panelist and giving us an opportunity to contribute. And all of you are welcome in The Hague at the OPCW in case you visit. And hopefully you can start your weekend after this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly come back to the question I asked in the beginning, whether trade is good or bad. And being in the WTO, it's kind of evident, but from our perspective, it's important to keep in mind that no matter the answer to the question, trade happens. It happens illegally, it happens legally, but it happens. And CITES aims to ensure that it happens in a sustainable, legal, safe, and traceable manner. If we banned all trade in wildlife, do you think it would go away? Probably not. So we might as well try to regulate it and monitor it so we can ensure that wild species are there also for our kids and grandkids. Thanks.
A very realistic view. Thank you very much, Pavel.
Thank you very much. I'm joining with what had been said by my speakers before me. I would like to say, yes, trade is important, very important also to supply controlled substances to people who need them, to supply chemicals to those who need them for legitimate purposes. But of course, trade in our substances, and we control almost 400 narcotic drugs, psychotropic substances, and chemicals. This trade must be regulated because there is some harm related to that. Transparency is very important. It has been mentioned here. I have brought with me some publications which we have, public, and this is not by far not everything. There are very detailed statistical information, as you mentioned, the trade and transparency of trade, transparency of these national estimates. This is everything available. So go into the INCB website, find out what are the estimates of quantities required by different countries, what is the real trade. Everything has to be reported and then published by INCB for the control by their countries. Also, transparency is a very important aspect of our work. Many, many thanks to the organizers. Excellent, excellent exchange of views. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to apologize to those in the room. We're not going to open the floor for questions. However, since you are here, I encourage you to approach the people in the panel in case you have any question and use this opportunity to ask them. I would like to conclude by thanking all of you, thanking all the panelists, thanking all the contributing organizations, those who are here, and also those of you who are actually following online as well. I think it was an absolutely interesting discussion. Now you can see why we really wanted to do this publication. And one thing I forgot to tell you at the beginning is we at some point were doing some activity, I think it was in Vienna. And because in Vienna you have several UN agencies, we invited some of those who are there. And then the Narcotics Board was one of them. And we also invited, it was the Wassenaar Arrangement. And it was absolutely fascinating experience. We were doing it supposedly for the participants, but I think the most excited people were those in the international organizations. We were learning so much. And then the idea came there from the beginning. And I think it's like my colleague, Simon Neumüller, who is sitting there, who had this idea of bringing these organizations back then. And thank you, Simon, for this idea. You can see now it ended up in something much bigger than the idea we had at the time. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. And thank you very much. And as we say in Geneva, bon weekend and safe travels if you go somewhere else. Thank you.